I want to thank you for joining us for the Florida Association of Museums webinar today, Hurricane Evacuation and Preparedness. The FAM Foundation is a not-for-profit organization that provides educational programs and services for the professional growth of Florida's museum community. The FAM Foundation, we host a variety of webinar-based and in-person programming. We offer resources on a variety of current topics on our website. You can check us out at flamuseums.org. We also organize a large annual conference, and we provide a lot of different platforms for museum professionals to connect with one another. So I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar, which is meant to help you get ready for our next hurricane season. They keep coming, whether we like it or not. So thank you for being here. I want to thank our partners today, the Florida Department of State, Division of Arts and Culture, Visit Florida, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Florida Humanities, and Curae Collections Care. Melinda is not able to join us today, but my name is Carmen Godwin. I'm the FAM Foundation Program Manager. You'll see FAM beside my name. If you have any questions throughout the program, any technical issues, anything like that, feel free to just directly message me in the chat box and I can help you out with those things. For the webinar today, a few housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded. Also, we do have closed captioning available. You can turn it on or off. There should be on your control panel a button that says closed captioning or a CC button that you can press to, again, turn that option on or off. If you have questions during the program, if you can raise your hand, you can type it in the chat box and I will make sure that your question gets asked to Rebecca. Or you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly. Next, we have a survey that will be sent to you after the program. I'll send you an email with the recording itself and also the survey. It'll only take a couple minutes to fill out, and it really helps us not only understand what you thought about this program, but what kind of programs that you would like to see FAM offer in the future. So we have a few poll questions for you. I'm going to launch those one at a time. And if you could just answer those for the group so that we can all see them. So the first one you'll see pop up, you should see a box right now that says, has your institution been impacted by a hurricane or tropical storm? And you can answer yes or no. Okay, we're 100% answered. Rebecca, you can see we've got 73% who've been impacted and 27% who have not been impacted.
I mean, honestly, I expect it to be higher, so that's kind of a good sign.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. Great, thank you.
All right, the next one is about risk assessment. So has your institution completed a risk assessment within the last year? Okay, we're 100% answered. That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. So 87% have not and 13% have.
Okay, great. I'm going to mention risk assessments a lot today, but just really to demonstrate the beauty that is a risk assessment. So good to know.
And is that something you ask people to do annually, Rebecca? Usually?
Yes, a risk assessment should be done annually. And I'll go over a little into detail about that for sure.
Okay. And then the final question that you'll see pop up is, does your institution's emergency plan include evacuation and preparedness from hurricanes? Yes to both, just evacuation, just preparedness, or no to both? Okay, great. So 50% or 47%, 50% are yes to both. And then we have some 25% just preparedness and 25% no to both. So it gives you a little bit of insight of where our group is, Rebecca.
Perfect. That's all very helpful. Thank you all for answering.
All right, great. Thank you so much. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is introduce Rebecca. Rebecca Kennedy is a collections care specialist and founder of Curae Collections Care. She's worked in Florida museums and was a collection manager and preservation specialist at the Smithsonian Institution for 11 years. She holds certifications in emergency preparedness, is the chair of the Association of Registrars Emergency Committee, and serves on the steering committee for the DC Alliance for Response. She has responded to emergencies throughout the nation on the ground, including Hurricanes Matthew, Michael, Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Dorian, as well as flooding that happened in Louisiana and Nebraska. In both emergencies, she promotes preparedness through trainings. I'm sorry, in between emergencies, she promotes preparedness through trainings like today for all size institutions and organizations. So it's really great to have somebody with us who's been on the ground and seen, how important it is to have the plans ready to go. So I'm going to allow you to share your screen.
Okay, should be shared.
Okay, yep, looks great.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll just start. So I'm Rebecca Kennedy, as Carmen said. I'm a collections care specialist, which essentially means I specialize in collections management, registration, and preservation, which includes emergency preparedness and response. I am also a Florida native, and my first museum job was working for an historical society in the state. I worked there during the 2004-2005 hurricane season, which consisted of approximately 15 storms. While I didn't know what I was doing then, it motivated me over the following 15 years to increase my knowledge and experience in protecting cultural heritage from emergencies and disasters. Today, I'll be focusing on hurricane evacuation preparedness. Hopefully you will find this information helpful. I will also direct you to many free resources to support this lecture and as an aid for you when building your plans and seeking buy-in. I will also leave plenty of time at the end for questions and answers, which I hope you'll take advantage of. But also, as Carmen said, please put questions in the chat box. And Carmen, let me know if I need to stop and answer those.
Okay, will do.
So the majority of the work to successfully recover from a hurricane has to happen before the storm even forms. I've responded to several disaster areas following hurricanes to assess cultural institutions, and there is a big difference in damage between those who took the time to prepare versus those who did not. The best way to understand what preparations are needed is to perform a risk assessment. You must do a risk assessment even before writing or updating your emergency plan. Risk assessments identify the biggest hazards, vulnerabilities, and exposure to your institution and should be interpreted into action items that ultimately will protect your institution and the collections. While I do not have time to go deep into how to perform a risk assessment today, I will be giving a virtual lecture on this topic in 4 days, May 2nd, for the Maine Archives and Museums Association. So feel free to register for that. I also travel to museums regularly to perform risk assessments for them, especially if it is their first one, as they can be daunting. I will admit that. If you're eager to jump in and start doing a risk assessment now, I can highly recommend the Risk Assessment Process Manual, which is a free for download on the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists website. It's a lot of words, but it's free and I helped co-author it. So you already get a lot of my thoughts and opinions on risk assessment from there. You can also check out the Florida Association of Museums YouTube channel for a lecture on threats identification and risk assessment. Once the risk assessment is done and you've interpreted your risk, you can start planning for mitigation and preparedness, which will at minimum consist of the action items listed here. I know many of these items might take a while to complete, so starting now and doing a little at a time is definitely better than nothing. I should note preparing for emergencies is kind of a constant, continuous activity, but getting started is the hardest part, and I'm honestly here to help you with that. So I'm going to go into each of these bullet points under number 2, and as I mentioned, I can't quite go fully into risk assessments, but I will mention them so much you will feel more proficient in them by the end of this lecture. All right, so let's start off with evacuation routes. There are 2 ways you can evacuate. One is inside your institution into another space, and the other is to an offsite location or an outside institution. So during blue skies is the perfect opportunity to have a serious discussion of the best locations. This is where the risk assessment comes in handy. So let's say your roof is in excellent repair, but you suffer from groundwater surge and you have an interior room on the 2nd floor. This might mean that that interior room on the 2nd floor is your best space to evacuate to internally inside your institution. Or let's say your roof is in disrepair, but you have a lower floor with interior room and no history of groundwater flooding, then that could be your best room. Another example is your institution is historically in a very low-lying area that constantly floods and your roof is in disrepair, then maybe you should consider taking your collections to an offsite location for an evacuation. Really, it's up to you and what is best for you. If you decide to evacuate to an offsite storage facility or institution, then it is recommended you have 2 options, each in different geographical directions, at least 100 miles away. This way you have a guaranteed access route to either offsite location, and one should, in theory, be outside of the hurricane path, direct path. As we know, the bands will go hundreds of miles. You will know which directions are best because you performed a risk assessment, which includes understanding how hurricanes and tropical storms impact your area. If you enter into a cooperative agreement at another institution for evacuation, I would highly recommend creating a legal document to state this cooperation. This could include the volume of material you're allowed to store there, the duration of the storage, and even reciprocity. Once you know where you are going, you can look at these access routes and make sure those are always clear. And that's a day-to-day, no boxes or trash or anything ever blocks these access routes. Then we can look at how are we moving collections throughout the building. If you don't have an elevator, but you definitely have to take stairs to get to this room you've picked in advance, then maybe carts aren't helpful. Or maybe instead you invest in carts that can go outside, or cars or trucks that will get you to your offsite location. If you're doing hand carrying, maybe you need to incorporate practicing hand carrying objects downstairs into part of your emergency plan. So honestly, mapping these routes, figuring them out, kind of deciding what room to do in advance, and having the tools you need to actually make it down those aisles is a huge benefit to do before the storm. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I will mention that while there might be a draw, especially for smaller institutions, to evacuate collections to private homes or use private vehicles, I would advise you to really do research to see if that is the best option. And I'm going to talk about that more in a moment. Finally, once you've mapped out these routes, put them in your emergency plan so that way they're available to everybody. I'm sure many of you have heard that an object priority list is important for emergency preparedness. These lists are primarily for evacuation planning. Storms, like life, are unpredictable. Events might form in a way where you only have an hour or two to evacuate and secure your building. Or the space you're evacuating to is very limited and you can only move so many objects in there. The priority list will help focus the evacuation and have the staff all working towards the same goal. Establishing priority lists are often steeped in bias. People's beliefs and backgrounds can influence what they think is a priority. Therefore, it is best that this list be created with several staff members of different backgrounds and experiences. If needed, I've definitely worked with organizations that have polled their community and their members to see what is the most important objects to them and what brings them day to day to your museum. It's working with the community is especially important when working with Indigenous or tribal collections. So just want to throw that out there. If your top priority objects are large and cumbersome and you only have a staff of 10, you might need to limit your priority list to 5 to 10 objects. While if you have a staff of 100 and most objects are small and compact, then your list can maybe be 50 objects or more. There really is no perfect number of objects on a priority list. It's up to you and your capacity, and doing a risk assessment can actually reveal some weaknesses in your capacity to respond, such as not having enough staff members or everything's considered a priority and no one can agree what it should be. Those are issues that can often be identified in a risk assessment. So now once you've identified.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that I've been adding some links in the chat box that you provided me, and I just wanted people to be aware of that they can copy those or reference them.
Great, thank you, Carmen. So once you've identified which objects are your priority, you need to note how to access them. If the object is on exhibition and only one person knows how to open the case, then it's not very accessible and can really slow down the evacuation process, therefore reducing the number of objects you can successfully evacuate. You can also have a tiered priority list where you have your top 5 objects that must be evacuated. And if there's time, you can move on to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, etc. Also, you need to plan if objects are on your if the objects on your priority list cannot be moved due to size, weight, or if they're a built element. And I'll go over that more in a little bit. And if you need more information on establishing priority list, I've created a free resource you can download off my website, which is probably one of the many resources Carmen is helpfully sharing in the chat box. So let's talk about those big things we can't move. If you have murals, sculptures, building elements, or any other thing large and cumbersome in your collection that cannot be evacuated, then you need to perform in situ stabilization. While technically not evacuating, protecting these objects should be part of the evacuation plan. So identify them and what type of supplies is required to stabilize them before the storm. Essentially, you are covering, padding, and building barriers around the objects. You probably have seen many examples of this in the recent reporting from the Ukraine. They're wrapping immovable heritage in fire blankets and sandbags. While fire blankets are not super helpful in a hurricane, sandbags are a great tool for rerouting water away from objects. If you believe the water will come from above, leaky roof, whatever, you can wrap the objects in plastic as seen in this middle image from the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. Protecting an entire building is much more complex. Sandbags around low-lying areas of your institution is the cheapest and most common solution, but there are larger, more expensive solutions, such as the water barrier system seen in the picture on your left, which is Vizcaya in Miami. Though good maintenance will go a long way in protecting an historic structure. So evacuating collections might require specific supplies and tools, and most of these can be bought prior to a storm showing up on the radar. So once you create those evacuation routes and plans, it should naturally reveal what supplies are needed for a successful evacuation. This includes supplies for movement, such as carts of any sort, temporary storage supplies if you're evacuating to a specific site, packing supplies, and in situ stabilization supplies. So as you work and you make these lists, it'll just make sense to you what you need to buy. But remember, majority of the supplies should just be standard day-to-day materials. You do not need preservation, conservation grade supplies in order to do an effective evacuation. Some of the best supplies actually can be found at your local hardware and grocery stores. And whenever I am brought in to help with evacuation or an emergency salvage, I bring very little supplies with me and I go to the local hardware store. I spent lots of time testing different supplies for emergencies to make preparedness and response affordable and accessible to most cultural institutions. So I'm going to ask you to trust me on this. If you need help identifying these supplies and want to learn more about, in general, building emergency supply kits, there's a helpful resource from the Association of Registrars and Collection Specialists that is free to download from the link on your screen, which I also help co-author. And it includes a list of supply suggestions and what those supplies can be used for. I've also given a lecture on the specific topic to the Alaska Museum and Archives Association that is currently free on their YouTube channel. It's only about 20 minutes, so you don't have to listen to me too much longer. So continuing with what to do before the storm, is you'll want to create all necessary forms and maps for evacuation, salvage, and safety. I always recommend emergency plans include maps of the evacuation routes, as I mentioned before, as well as maps of collection storage spaces, where the emergency supplies are kept. You can even, if you want to, pre-plan how you're going to set up your temporary storage space and lay all that out and put that map into your emergency plan. And you can even put a map of your priority list objects so people know where they are at the institution. Though I will mention the more common thing is people get reflector tape and they put them on the cabinets or on the boxes where those priority objects are, which is not super feasible if the object's on exhibition, but it's just an idea people use is reflector tape for quick identification. But a map is also super helpful. So for forms, make sure you have a template or several copies of an object tracking form to know where the objects you're evacuating are being relocated. I know most people think they will just use the inventories from their database, but that's not always feasible, and it actually takes longer to do. Like, for example, when you show up to a conference and we all wait in those long lines in the alphabet of our last names, we go up to the person at the front, we give them our last name. They flip through 5 or 6 pieces of paper till they hunt down your name and they check it off. It takes like 5 seconds, but someone coming up saying their name and walking away takes 1 second. So often creating these tracking lists where you just write things down is faster than looking through piles of pages. Hopefully that analogy makes sense. Incident reports and damage assessments essentially are trying to gather what happened to your institution during the storm. These are completed by a small team, and based on what is discovered and reported, they should be able to determine the supplies, people, and space needed for a full salvage response. And then the results of these incident reports and damage assessments can then be communicated to the rest of the staff to put the rest of your emergency plan into action. You also need a re-entry checklist, which should be completed by everyone before entering a damaged or impacted site. This checklist should include aspects like, are utilities safe? Do you have permission to enter? Do you have appropriate PPE? Do you have a means of communication? Do you have a buddy? Do you understand your purpose? Do you have the supplies to complete your purpose? And anything else you can possibly think of to make sure everyone who enters the building safely will exit the building safely. So there are several good examples of these types of forms online from other museums. You can just do a Google search, but always make sure you customize them specifically for your institution. And you can always edit and change these forms as you learn more through trainings or actual incidences. So all of these topics we've covered so far, evacuation routes, priority lists, supplies, in situ stabilization, and forms, all need to be added to your plan. These are often things that go into the appendix of your emergency plan, but definitely put them in there. Write an emergency plan seems daunting, but should be done before any storm. Just remember, they don't need to be complex, and they are actually technically never done. They should be a living document that changes as your institution grows, decreases, changes its mission. But just in general, best practices for emergency response also change quite frequently. So it's a living document. But it's important because it establishes decisions and prevents arguments during an active emergency or even emotional decision making. Putting in a hurricane evacuation plan is just a part of this emergency plan. Some institutions I know like to have a separate hurricane plan, which is fine, but not necessary. Do what works best for your institution. But, let's be honest, most people are not going to read an emergency plan and just be ready to respond. You must set up trainings that enforce the actions outlined in the plan. The best trainings are those that use scenario-based learning and role-playing. Trainings can also have the side benefit of revealing weaknesses in your risk assessments and your emergency plans that can be updated and addressed prior to an emergency. So now you have all these great plans, you have everything worked out, but you still need to run it by your insurance. And I'm not an insurance expert. I've just seen too many people make decisions and then the insurance would not cover any sort of damage. So I really want to point out insurance. You need to see if your insurance covers objects being stored in an offsite location during an emergency. If so, are there any requirements for that space? If you're transferring objects by vehicle, what type of insurance does that need? Are volunteers allowed to help? And if they get hurt, are they covered by your insurance? Is staff covered by your insurance? Really, working with emergencies, a lot can go wrong. So it's good to have your evacuation plans, hurricane plans, emergency plans reviewed by your insurance company to make sure you're not doing anything out of scope. Send them as much information as you want, and if they can't help you, you can probably find another insurance company that will actually work with your plan. I'm not saying to quit your insurance company, do what works for you. So we've talked specifically about preparedness. So all of that was preparedness for evacuating your collections, but your risk assessment might point out other issues that put your collections in harm's way that require mitigation. If you don't know the difference, mitigation is something we can actively do to improve our buildings, the way we care for our collections, while preparedness is something like we train on where there's too many variables and we can't actually make improvements then, but we're prepared to make improvements if something bad happens. So that's a very loose difference between preparedness and mitigation. So the risk assessment usually reveals both things that need to be prepared for and things that can be mitigated. And part of that is it should note if you have any building repair issues. Do your drains need to be clear? Is your roof in good shape? Are the windows and doors properly sealed? Buildings in disrepair cause damage to collections slowly day by day as it is, but are a huge vulnerability during a hurricane and are more likely to suffer extreme damage. Next, part of mitigation is you need to ask if your objects are properly cataloged and documented. After flooding or hurricanes, objects might almost be unrecognizable. They can be broken, scattered, or as I've seen on too many occasions, several objects in one giant mud pile. If we do not know how many objects we had before a storm hit, we won't know how many objects are missing, which can slow recovery drastically. And also can impact your funding opportunities because you don't really know how much to ask for because you don't know what's all missing. Which brings us to the the last topic is, got to ask yourself, are your objects stored correctly? When visiting cultural heritage sites after hurricanes, so many times the damage assessment reveals that if the objects had been stored properly, they would not have been lost or damaged, or they would have been damaged to a significantly lesser degree. This includes, something as simple as having them off the floor, enclosed cabinets, or at least on metal shelving that's been covered during the storm. I know many of you are probably thinking this cost a lot of money to have all this fixed. Believe me, I know. But having a risk assessment you can send to funders when requesting money makes any grant application much more appealing. Every few years, FEMA and other industry experts release the Mitigation Saves report. And this report discusses the cost of the average response and recovery versus mitigation. So for the longest time, the report stated that for every $1 you spend on mitigation, which is, everything we've been talking about for the most part, because preparedness slides in under this report, you save $4 on response and recovery. However, because emergencies and disasters are more common, response and recovery is becoming big business. And the latest report now says that for every $1 you spend on mitigation, you save $13 on response and recovery. So indeed, these mitigation practices do save you money in the long run, especially if you're in a high risk area for emergencies like hurricanes and tropical storms. These reports are free to download. There's even an extra report for coastal flooding, and use them to advocate for mitigation precautions to be taken at your institution. That's what they're there for. I worked with this one institution that the collections staff was constantly being told they could not afford the $3,000 to buy cabinetry to store their collection. Hurricane comes through, flash flood through their collection storage area. Almost every object was extremely damaged, but then it cost over $100,000 to do conservation treatment on everything. And once something's damaged, it never goes back to how it perfectly was before. But in the long run, if they had those cabinets, they probably would have only had about $4,000 or $5,000 in damage. So it's hard to watch that because we're constantly told there's no money to do X, Y, and Z. But luckily, there are a lot of good grant funders who are willing to fund things like cabinets, building repairs, and even getting part-time staff to document and catalog your collection. So it's worth looking into, and having those risk assessments shows why you're asking for this money. So that concludes the section on what to do before the storm, which is a lot, but makes sense because before the storm is when you have the most time. But I want to move forward now on what to do if you have a storm watch versus a storm warning. I'm sure you all have seen the taco explanation before of the difference between the two. But just to be clear, with a watch, the storm could happen, but not guaranteed you'll get direct impact. While with a hurricane warning, it's happening. You're definitely probably going to be impacted. I'm sure you all know this, but I want to make sure we are all on the same page of the difference. I recommend in your emergency plan, you set up activities by these triggers, such as you do normal preparedness day to day. Then if a storm watch is called, you do a predetermined next level list of activities. And if there's a storm warning, you do even more activities. Having these built-in triggers for activities also prevents unnecessary handling of objects, which increases the risk of breaking or dissociation. I'll go into this a little bit more. So if you're under a storm watch, this is when you should mobilize securing and stabilizing your building and collections for the impact of winds, rains, storm surge, or groundwater flooding, or all the above. During the risk assessment, you should have already noted which of these issues is most likely to occur and can plan accordingly. The list of tasks should not be long at this point, as the storm watch indicates you only have about 48 hours before a possible impact. Outdoor sculptures and architectural elements need to be secured or relocated to not be damaged or used as projectiles during the storm. In the same vein, secure any non-collection outdoor elements such as benches, trees, and other possible projectiles like signs, and board up your windows. This is a time when, at minimum, you relocate collections away from doors and windows. Also elevate collections off the floor, the recommended minimum of 6 inches. Though if your risk assessment reveals that you have a history of flooding up to a foot in your collection storage, elevation, the 6-inch elevation is clearly not enough, and you might want to consider evacuating to another interior space. And also at this point, cover all cabinets, shelves, and large objects with plastic sheeting. So during a storm watch is also the time to implement your evacuation plan. I am not saying you should evacuate every single time you're under a storm watch. Anytime you evacuate and move collections, there is a risk of them being dropped, broken, lost, dissociated, and more. So we really only want to evacuate when absolutely necessary. Again, I would encourage you to set up triggers in your emergency plan under the storm watch, specifically for evacuation. And those triggers get divided into evacuating inside your institution versus offsite. Whether to evacuate or not cannot be left up to a single individual. There needs to be triggers and guidance in the emergency plan that prevents panicked and emotional decision-making. For example, if you're under a storm watch and you are in the projected path of the hurricane, then evacuate off-site to a predetermined location. But if you're outside the projected path, but still in a high wind flood rain area, you might want to evacuate to an elevated interior space of your institution. Or another example is if you're outside the projected path, but it's a category 3 to 5, maybe you should consider sending just your priority objects off-site, especially if your building has any elements of disrepair. You can even set up triggers specifically by the category of a hurricane, such as you evacuate this much if it's a tropical storm, this much if it's category 1 through 3, this much if it's a category 4 through 5. As you can see from these examples, there are so many variables that could say when it's appropriate to evacuate your collection that I can't really give you a one size fits all because you're all located in different parts of the state, have different types of collections, have different types of buildings. So you really need to do these risk assessments to really hone in on what works best for you. But just keep in mind, as part of that risk assessment, what are your hazards, what are your vulnerabilities, and what is your exposure to the storm coming? And then make your plans accordingly. You can also make in your emergency plan a decision matrix where you're like, oh, okay, it's storm has been declared, hurricane watch. Is it a hurricane yet? Yes or no? Is it a tropical storm? Things like that. You could just make it until it says, yes, definitely evacuate to this location. I would love to make a matrix I could just share with everyone, but again, every institution is so different, it would be near impossible. So if you decide to evacuate, you need to do it correctly with museum professional standards. Remember, if this is an evacuation, then no collection should be damaged at this point. You're moving them to prevent damage. If objects have already been damaged, then it's called a salvage, which is a whole other lecture series. If your institution decides to evacuate, you need to assess the hazard, as mentioned in all the previous slides. How big is the storm? When is it arriving? Are we in the path, etc.? And based on that information, you can send one team to start blocking the hazards, bringing in the projectiles, boarding windows, things like that. Simultaneously, a logistics team should start coordinating all the moving elements, such as notifying insurance, calling in people to help, maybe even ordering food and drink for workers, buying or bringing in supplies and other logistical tasks. And while all that is happening simultaneously, the documentation team begins working with the packing and relocating team to document which objects are ending up in what boxes and where those boxes are ending up. Remember, I mentioned dissociation is one of the main risks that happens during an evacuation. So people documenting all the movements is a vital part for a successful recovery. And the packing team should also be trained to pack things carefully so that nothing breaks in transit. Again, I have a whole other training about documenting emergencies, as it takes some skill, but can be learned and replicated at your institution. I wish it was, again, as easy as checking things off your inventory list, but at least it's a start. So part of the moving relocation team's jobs is the moving the packed objects to their new temporary storage location. If the new storage site isn't set up and you might need to send a team ahead to begin setup, if the site is not set up, you might need to send a team to set it up before the first delivery arrives. If being moved off site, you need to have vehicles. As part of the documentation, write down the license plate, make and model of the vehicle, and a copy of the driver's license. I know this sounds paranoid, but there has been too many reported cases of trucks not showing up to their destination for me not to mention this precaution. And I know this comment makes it sound more reasonable to use private cars, but many insurance policies will not cover damage or loss to museum objects in private vehicles. And majority of museum thefts are actually inside jobs. Not saying any institution would do it, it just happens. So just in general, another great precaution is to have a second person always in the vehicle, whether it's a staff member or a trusted board member. There should always be two people in the vehicle, whether it's a rental truck or a private car. When objects get to their temporary storage location, the exact location should be noted either in your collections management system or on your tracking sheets. And we often use these temporary storage locations in the same format that we track the locations in regular storage, by building, room, shelf, aisle, whatever is a good identifier or location. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm against using private vehicles in private homes. And the private home is for the same reason as the vehicle, is that insurance may not cover any damage and also increases the likelihood of objects being lost. It's amazing how often objects are just lost at a private home. I honestly don't know how that happens, but it does. So for example, after one hurricane, we had this major issue with someone, objects were sent to this person's private home. And then when they asked for them back, the person insisted that these were their objects. And because the museum had done inadequate cataloging and registration on all their objects, they didn't have enough proof that it was theirs to hold up in court. So essentially this person got free artifacts. And another time, and this has actually happened more than once, a home was destroyed by the hurricane and all the objects that had been stored there were damaged. But because the objects were taken to a private home, the museum's insurance would not cover the cost of conservation and recovery. So this is part of talking about talking to your insurance, but also private homes are not necessarily safer. So it's something to keep in mind. Essentially, evacuation is easy if you've worked out all these logistics ahead of time. If you want to learn more, there is a great free resource from ICROM called The Emergency Evacuation of Heritage Collections. That's about 50 pages of diagrams showing how to carry out an evacuation. It's a super helpful resource. And in my opinion, probably one of the best one out there on evacuation. So when training or performing an evacuation, I would definitely use this resource as sort of like a textbook on how it should be done. So I participated in many evacuations, as well as training people to do evacuations, and I have a few tips I can offer you. These tips are not usually something you put in an emergency plan, but just something to keep in mind. First, an evacuation is only successful if there is good communication and leadership. We all have different communication styles, and when under stress, it becomes much harder to understand and interpret instructions. This is why training is so important. You build up muscle memory so you're not relying on your brain as much. And each training is also inadvertently a training on communication. And on top of that, just keep in mind that an effective leader of an evacuation will have already good communication skills during a crisis and under stress. Documentation I've mentioned a few times already. You cannot drop documentation standards just because it is an emergency. We must always keep track of our collections accurately. Documentation is one of the slowest part of an evacuation, so I often let them set the pace instead of having one of the other groups rush them. Be aware of physical limits of your staff. It is not advised at all for people to work 24 hours straight evacuating collections. It's a lot of being on your feet, driving, moving, very physical. And essentially, we all become exhausted, and exhaustion leads to people having more physical injuries and making bad decisions. So it's best just to let people rest. You always have the option to have your staff work in shifts or teams, so everyone does get enough rest. That's fine. That's great. It's actually preferred. Another option is to reassign teams. So if you have people constantly lifting and moving boxes, after a few hours, they can be reassigned to something more sedentary, such as logistics or documenting. So once someone starts doing one task, does not mean they can't start doing another task. Rotate people so there is no exhaustion. So all that can happen under storm watch. So now let's move on to storm warning. At this point, we know the storm is happening. This is usually a very short window until the storm arrives. So the list of tasks should also be short. At this point, you should just be double checking your storm watch list and making sure everything is finished up. Then just lock the doors and windows and leave. Go home and be safe. Or at that point, you can evacuate yourself and your family. No matter what is happening, your safety and the safety of your family is first priority. So don't try to push it to the limit where you then get stuck out in the storm. Then during the storm, continue to monitor and track the storm movements. This does not need to be done obsessively, but hearing the location of storm surge, flooding, power outages, and closed roads can provide really helpful insight into what you might face from returning to your institution. And with that information, you can start formulating a response plan. For example, if you learn the roads leading to your institution are flooded or a bridge is out, you can communicate that information to your team so everyone will arrive safely. Or you can learn there was flooding and the power is out in the area of your institution. So now whoever shows up must have appropriate flooding PPE as well as flashlights, things like that. Just informative. Hearing something bad happening around your institution does not mean you should run out the door and check on your institution in the middle of the storm. Just use that information to plan and wait until it is safe to respond, which many times could actually be several days after the hurricane has passed. Do not rush it. Take your time. Also work out beforehand and put in your emergency plan how your team will communicate during the storm if needed. Otherwise, just stay inside and be safe. So when the storm is over and you can finally send a team to assess the damage, be sure to approach the scene safely and have a plan. The initial arrival on site should be by a small team as predetermined in your emergency plan to do an incident report and damage assessment. Too many people on site at a given time creates chaos and can even make an emergency situation much worse. I have many stories on that, but short on time, I have lots of stories. So whomever shows up on site should complete a reentry checklist, as I mentioned before. Those reentry checklists should be in your emergency plan. And if you go and fill one out and you cannot check off everything on that list, then you do not enter and wait until it is safe to do so. I'm super firm on this checklist because I want everyone to go home safely. And also, I'm assuming ambulances and hospitals will also be busy at this time and don't want you to have to wait too long. So once all that is done, you can start your salvage operation if needed. Hopefully not. Salvage is, again, a whole other lecture, but fortunately, I've already given this lecture for the Florida Association of Museums, and it is available on their YouTube channel. So check it out if you want to listen to me for another hour. When I do these lectures and trainings, I get some common questions. The first is, should we leave staff on site during a storm? I immediately would ask you, why are you leaving your staff? What is the purpose and the goal of them remaining behind? I personally would not leave staff on site without a clear directive of their purpose. Most often, staff left on site can only sit there and watch water rise, which is not helpful. I've seen in the news and people telling me that staff being on site meant that they could move objects out of the way of rising water or reclose doors and windows that were popped open by the storm. But if you've done all these proper before the storm activities, then none of that should have actually been an issue. The only time I would be okay leaving staff on site is if you have a living collection such as the Hemingway cats. So from my experience, cats will ride out a hurricane and show up perfectly dry. The other time staff being on site is okay is if you care for a tribal or indigenous collection and it is part of their tradition to leave someone to protect the objects. All I can do is offer my advice on this topic, but if you do leave staff on site, be sure to leave them with PPE, food, water, and a reliable form of communication. Also, make sure any injuries they sustain or damage they cause to the collection is covered by your insurance. The next most common question is, who should be in charge in an evacuation? And the answer is, whoever is the most qualified and trained. The standard hierarchy in a museum does not necessarily apply to emergencies. There's a role for everyone in emergency, but the leader should have the qualifications to make effective and calm decision-making for an evacuation. People often think that this is the director, and it could be, but directors are often torn in many different directions after emergency, from talking to funders, talking to constituents, talking to the media, and they don't necessarily have time to manage the minutiae of an evacuation. The third most common question is, where am I supposed to store all of these supplies you suggest? Well, you only really need to have enough supplies to get started. If you look at the resource I mentioned on emergency kits, you will see most of the supplies is easily found at hardware and grocery stores. So if you have enough to get started, part of the logistics team can go and buy more once you know exactly how much you're moving. You can also consider creating a shared cache of supplies with nearby institutions, which I go over a lot more in the lecture for the Alaska Museums Association. What if we do everything right, but the collection still gets damaged? You did your best, and that's all you can do. And if you write in your emergency plan these precautions and whatever you want to do to prepare for an emergency, if someone comes and tries to blame you, you'd say, no, we've thought about this very clearly by doing a risk assessment and writing this out in a plan, and we followed our plan exactly. And having that sort of backup of your emergency plan is a great precaution for any other issues that might come up of people unwilling to give you money because you lost objects. Clearly you're not responsible, but you are, because you did everything right. And that's all you can do. The other most common question is, we only have a few people on staff. How are we supposed to evacuate an entire collection? Well, you don't. You really only need to evacuate your priority list. However, I really would encourage you that if you have a small staff and you're really worried about your manpower, to start talking to other institutions in your area to see if you can form a cooperative that will help each other out in emergencies. But I've also used volunteers from the junior league, local clubs. I've even used fraternities and sororities as a resource for having people come in and help. When you bring in people like this who've not been trained on anything, we do what's called field training, where we have them come in and we don't weigh them down with the minutia of the whole entire evacuation procedure. We just say, you stand right here, you take a box from this person and you put the box on that truck, and they say, okay, and then you move on. So there is stuff for volunteers to do that is not, requires a lot of skill, but just make sure when you do field training, it is for a specific repetitive task and not something complex. So I know this was a lot of information and you may not receive specific answers to your questions. So I wanted to leave more time for Q&A, but I went on a little long. But before we get to that, I wanted to let you know I've written up a guide on hurricane evacuation preparedness. That's essentially a brief summary of topics covered in this lecture. It's available for free download on my website. So with that, thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to listen to this lecture. And I hope I'll be able to provide some clarity on this difficult topic. if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. So I'm always happy to answer anything. So with that, are there any questions we want to ask on the scant 4 minutes I left behind?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. That was so rich in information. And just so everybody knows, you can copy the chat. There's a little ... at the bottom. You can copy the chat, or I will be sending you a survey afterwards, and I will also have a recording of this program, as well as the resource list with the different links and stuff will be included in that email as well. Does anybody have any questions for Rebecca at this time? You can, here I have one new message. Let's see. Sam is asking, what role do consortia generally play in planning?
Sorry, I don't know what a TBLC consortia is. Samuel, could you clarify?
Oh,
Tampa Bay Library Consortium. Got it. Thank you. So you can work with a consortia or any sort of group to make the plans, especially if you have similar collections, similar needs, and not enough staff. This is very these are actually formed all over the United States. Most of them take on the look of what's called an alliance for response. There's only one alliance for response, and it's in Miami, or there's only one alliance for response in Florida, and it's in Miami. There's dozens across the United States, but essentially they are consortia that get together, train together, use the resources together, rent warehouses together to store supplies. And so if you're willing to set one up and force people to participate, they are great and can actually work together to form an emergency plan. You can share them. Hopefully that answers your question.
anybody else? Again, you can type it in the chat box, but you can also just unmute yourself. Sam, do you want, okay, he's just giving a thumbs up. Okay, good. Does anybody else want to unmute themselves or type a question in the chat box? Katie is just saying thank you, that it was an excellent presentation.
Oh, glad y'all liked it. As I was telling Carmen, I could probably talk about this forever, but hopefully those resources give you some more tools.
And then we have, as Bart's asking, as a government-funded museum, our county facility is in charge of the building. How do we help them understand the priorities of the museum?
That's a good question. And fortunately, well, okay, I won't say fortunately, but there is sort of a solution. One of the things I've had to work with other county or state organizations to do is actually work with the emergency management teams at that county to be incorporated into their mitigation and emergency plans. So if you've not looked at the county's emergency mitigation plan, I would ask for a copy. It might be available for free on their website, and see if your institution is mentioned. And if it's not, you need to start advocating to be included in their plan. And once you are in that big county document, you will become a priority in their response. But you can also start inviting them to site visits, talking to them about your collection, and even asking their input on your emergency plan to start facilitating that buy-in. But you really need to get on the county's emergency management mitigations plan.
That's a great idea. Barbara says, thank you, excellent. Bart says, thank you. Any other questions? You mentioned that you were able to travel and help do risk assessments. What is involved when you come?
Usually if a museum or institution wants me to do, I show up. Depending on the size of your institution, I walk around for a day or 2 days. I'll have to see copies of all your emergency plans and any forms you have. Even look deep into your cataloging and registration methods and general housing day to day, and can write up a report that you can then take to your administrators and so forth to start seeking funding. And I always try to write them in a way where like NEA and NEH will also like them and give funding. But essentially, I just look deep at your institution, ask a lot of awkward questions, and then write up a report. So it's usually a day or two obligation.
Thank you. Anybody else? I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to get their questions answered.
Yeah. Also, feel free to email me if you think of one later when you have
Yeah,
nightmares
I'll-
at night thinking about hurricanes.
I'll make sure to include Rebecca's contact information in the email I send so that you can follow up with her. This is a great time to be going back through your risk assessment, really kind of going back through your plan and prepping now instead of waiting for when the storm comes. So I'm glad that we were able to have you here today to kind of go through some of this prep with us. We will have some extra programs coming up next month and in the fall. You can check out flamuseums.org for more information. You can also visit our Twitter and Facebook, our different social media. The handle is FLA Museums. And we do have a special like group for museum professionals on the Facebook page. So you can join that group. And that's really more for like asking general questions about things that are going on and having your peers kind of help you with that. So that's a private group. And then we're settling the dates for the conference in Miami in September, October. We should have those in the next week. And we hope that you can maybe join us for that as well. Any final thoughts, Rebecca, before we pop off?
I wish you all good luck in this coming hurricane season.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.
All right, everybody take care.